maybe, here it was, there we go.
We're gonna talk about the railroad time service. The railroad time service lasted about 150 years. From around the 1830s, when the first railroad started running, until the 1980s. As a matter of fact, as recently as 1995, 30 years ago. I've got a timetable here. Norfolk Southern Railroad, Tennessee Division, dated July 23rd, 1995. And in the back of that book, it's got all the watches, the pocket watches and wrist watches that are still allowed by Norfolk Southern. As recently as 30 years ago. All right, we're gonna talk about the importance of time in railroading then and now. And then go back all the way to the 1830s, up to the present day. How time was and is kept on the railroads today. How standard time and time zones evolve. The time zones that we take for granted today, the 4 time zones that we observe today are not the time zones that existed in 1870, 1880s. Definition of standard of a railroad pocket watch, which would be a standard watch. And developmental features of railroad pocket watches from the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s. Next, please. Now I have to read this because I never can remember this word for word. Orient yourself there with the map. On the left, you're going to be leaving Rochester, you're headed for Syracuse. And from Syracuse, you're going to go to Utica on the Syracuse and Utica Railroad. But you're on your way to Albany, which is all the way over in the east, and you're going to go through about 3 or 4 railroads to do that. Now, these were short line railroads. Most of them 7, 8, 10 miles. Very rarely were they more than that. That's the reason there are over 475 railroads in the northeastern United States early on. Everybody was going to get rich and build their own railroad if they had the capital. But you're on your way to Albany. It's 1848. You just arrived in Syracuse, New York. You took the Rochester and Syracuse Railroad from Rochester, New York. And you were planning to make connections with the Syracuse and Utica Railroad to continue your journey eastward to Albany, New York. You should have time to make your connection. You're arriving at 10:10 a.m. according to the conductor. And the Syracuse and Utica train will depart at 10:18. 8 minutes legally. According to the time to that line's timetable. But alas, your target connection left at 10:08 a.m. according to Rochester time. You have missed your connection. The railroads are doing an excellent job of running on time, but each on their own time. They each have their own time standard. The Syracuse and Utica is using Utica time, 10 minutes ahead of Rochester. Now, something that most of you may not know is for every 12.5 miles east-west that you go on the map, you've got 1 minute change in time. And the further we went west from the East Coast, North New England, upper northeast, further we went west, the more time constraints they had between connections between railroads. When you had to make a change in trains. The same existed for freight as well as passenger. Next, please. Anyone want to take a guess at how one would set his watch or clock in the early 1800s?
However they wanted. However they wanted.
Well, kind of sort of. Mostly it was by sundial. Okay. Real accurate time. It was either a sundial or the town time standard, such as a courthouse clock or a church clock in the steeple. And the church clock or a jeweler's regulator. But most of the time they were set by a sundial. it wasn't until the telegraph that the jeweler's regulator, that they got a telegraph signal and knew how to set their clock. How was the railroad, how was the railroad home terminal clock set in the early 1800s? Again, by sundial. How was the time distributed between railroad stations and employees in early 1800s? Every railroad had a standard clock in their home office, the terminal office. And the railroaders would take their time from that terminal clock. But it was each railroad is on its own time. Okay. You can see the mismatch there in time. But the conductors would transfer that time along the stations along the line into the other employees off of his watch after he had taken it from that standard clock. It belonged to each railroad. Next, please. Bad day. If we're gonna have a cornfield meet, as we call it. These were head-on collisions. On a one-way railroad, you've got two-way traffic. So you're gonna have to have a time interval separation of trains. And that was done by timetable and watches and clocks.
Glenn, with all the different railroads, did they change crews every time they went to a different?
Not necessarily, in those days, say around the 1900s, a day's work was 100 miles. You might go 50 out and 50 back, if you came back to the home terminal, or you might go 100 miles or a little over 100 miles, plus some overtime to another terminal and spend the night there. And the next crew going southbound will come back to that train. That's how you brought your train back, but you're gonna normally work about 100 miles a day. So,
How, typically, how long would that 100 miles take?
10 or 12 hours. These trains weren't running that fast. If you consider the locomotives that they had in those days, like the one that the General is, it's ensconced there in Kennesaw, Georgia. Has any of you been to the Civil War Museum locomotive history there in Kennesaw? Well, that locomotive that used to be in Chattanooga is now entombed in that museum, and they did that intentionally so it would never escape. The Yankees were going to come to get it again and hit the Chattanooga. Standard time and time zones. Travelers making transfers faced many different railroad times that I've already said. In 1870, there were more than 400 railroads operating on 75 different time stamps. As in time zones. In 1880, there were over 600 railroads working on 49 different time stamps. Now imagine all the confusion there when making connections between lines. Next, please. This is a perfect example right here of some of the travelers' aids. This is prior to 1883, and 1883 is a notable date. We'll get to that here shortly. The one on the left there is New York, and I think the one on the right is Washington.
Yes.
And the straight lines radiating off, it's 12 noon at both Washington and New York on both of those maps. Those pictures. The straight lines leading out with the numbers on or mileage from that point to the point up there around the perimeter of that circle. And it shows you the difference in time. So if it's in noon in, let's say, way up on the left, New York, in Boston, 236 miles away, they're both in the same time zone today. It was noon in New York, it was 12:12 in Boston.
Yeah.
You see the difference in time then? But this was a traveler's aid to help travelers, hopefully.
Hopefully.
Hopefully, yeah. Next, please. Now, this is a picture. Watch that we had in our exhibit, the national exhibit in 2015 up in Chattanooga. This belonged to Alden Dreyer. He is the great grandson of Albert Brown. He still lives in Massachusetts, not far from the Hoosac Tunnel, where his grandfather. Maybe. But Alden's getting up, he's in his late 80s now. But he lent this watch to us, that belonged to his grandfather in 1844. You notice it's got 2 dials, plus the seconds bit down at the bottom. One of those dials is for city time, the other is for railroad time, and those differ too. Okay. You get all these different times that you're juggling. If you had railroad business, you went by the railroad side of it. For in certain cases, like Seth Thomas number 6, I have a copy of one. It's called Seth Thomas time. It's got 2 dials on it. One for railroad time, the other for city time. And not many of them survive. That's a key one set watch. You see the square hole, the round holes in the back right there, but that's got a square arbor. You put a, wind it up. Now, it had a spring for each side, both times. 1844, an invention made possible transmission of railroad time over a great instantaneously. Somebody named that invention. Telegraph. Yep, that's correct. Next. Samuel F. sends a historic message, what hath God wrought? May the 24th, 1844, from Washington, D.C. Now, up until that time, the Pony Express was carrying mail from the Midwest to the West Coast. When the telegraph came on board, 2 days later, the Pony Express was no more. Little tidbit that you may find interesting.
Do y'all know what Samuel F.B. Morse actually did for a living? He's a portrait painter, but he became fascinated with the on-off and what you might be able to do with it.
Next, please. How did the railroads use the telegraph? Well, they used them for the transmission, or for one thing. Now, remember, this was invented in 1844, but you didn't instantaneously have telegraph lines strung up beside the railroad.
Mhm.
Instantaneously, that's the big infrastructure. It took years to establish that. It wasn't until the Transcontinental Railroad, 1860, we had telegraphs going out to the West Coast.
The telegraph was actually before.
But they used the telegraph to distribute time. And that was a time signal that was usually on the East Coast in Eastern time zone. Transmitted by the Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C. at 12 noon. Or time zone, you were in Mountain Time, it was 10 o'clock, and if you were in Pacific, it was 9 o'clock. But they transmitted it, from stations along the lines, and at about 3 minutes until 12 o'clock, the telegraph operators had to close their circuit, all the business that you want to go on that line, just to receive this time signal. And once they received that time signal, they could set their clocks. Clock, if they had a standard clock, it was designated as a standard clock. Or whatever station clock they had, they could set their clock, they could spike it, set it to the correct time.
Glenn, do you know the stringing those wires? What was the standard? How high the wire was off the ground?
It was a standard, but you said the tops of the railroad cars.
It had to be for somebody to get at it.
Oh,
And during
interesting.
the Civil War, they started doing this,
Yeah, well,
and so they made them higher.
Oh.
a lot of them were
That's
down at
interesting.
almost track level because they run a ditch. At any rate,
Just to do it.
railroads recognize time issues and transfer passengers of goods. In 1883, I told you I was going to mention this later, and here it is. In 1883, the railroads adopted standard time zones. But not everybody bought into that. The clergy and farmers primarily. Clergy said, time is divinely set. Farmer said, you're not gonna tell me when I can plant my crops. I plant by the moon. Time zones were therefore not universally accepted in the public sphere.
Still aren't. Still aren't. You like saying stuff?
The US did not adopt standard time until 1918, when taking over the railroads to move, that's when the railroads were nationalized. Until 1918, when taking over the railroads to move troops and materials in World War I. Safety on the railroad changed not one whit. Adjusting to the new time was scarcely more than moving the minute hand on all station clocks and employee watches at the same time. This is also the day that was referred to today at 2 noons. Y'all heard that story today at 2 noons? That's what it's all about right there.
2 noons, not 2.
Now, here are the time zones that were established by the General Time Convention in Chicago in 1883. They started at, Eastern Time Zone started at, the 75th meridian. Central started at the 90th meridian. Mountain at the 105th meridian, and Pacific at the 120th meridian. Over 15 degrees apart. If you multiply 15 times 24 time zones around the earth, the circumference of the earth, you'll get 360 degrees, a full circle. Those lines are no longer straight, I can tell you. Because Chattanooga is right on the edge of Central and Eastern time zone. All you have to do is drive down to Trenton, Georgia, John, and you're in Central time, aren't you? Okay. For this time in early railroading, early railroads ran by train orders and timetables. Accurate watches prevented head-on collisions on single-track railroads. In the 1840s and 50s, railroads had watch requirements. Actually, they had watch requirements from the day they started running railroads in the 1830s. It's just that they weren't universal across all the railroads. Okay, each railroad had its own different set of rules. They may not jive with the next railroad. Next. It was critical for employees assigned to time to train service to compare watches. In the early railroading, railroad standard time was raised from terminals to stations along the line via conductor's watches, which have been set by the home terminal clock. We've already talked about that. That's a classic picture right there of an engineer. This is a New York Central locomotive, and I'm not sure if it's a Niagara, a 464 or 484 locomotive, but that's the conductor in the uniform on the right, engineer on the left, got a chromo cap and it's overalls.
That guy's name is Bubba.
Yeah. Next. In the early 1800s, most of your watches were Swiss or English. And before the Americans started making watches during the Industrial Revolution in the 1850s, all the watches that were bought had to be bought from either from England or the Swiss. The Camden and Amboy, for instance, bought 45 watches from Barad and Lund of London. It's Lund, Barad and Lund of London. But these watches were about $100 a piece in 1844. And time value of money, that means that would have been $4,175 today. Okay. They were very expensive. The railroads couldn't afford it. So the railroads were buying them and supplying their employees, primarily the engineers, was one by the station agent. And they were supposed to turn it back in the same condition at the end of the day. Well, that didn't work. They weren't returned in the same condition, and they started showing up in pawn shops. Okay, so Pennsylvania Railroad tried that twice. They had learned their lesson the first time and tried it again. Because even at $100 in 1880s, that was still a sizable chunk of money for an engineer. For instance, an engineer was paid by weight on drivers. Not the total weight of the locomotive, but just the weight on drivers. And they might make $4.34 a mile. I've already told you that 100 miles is a day. Well, that's $4.34 I made today for a 100-mile trip. So I've got a $90 watch. How much do you think I can afford? I don't have a car to pay for, but I've got a house, I've got clothes, I've got groceries to buy. And this watch is a big expense in my budget. So they had to buy them on time through the company and make monthly payments, generally in about 6 months to pay these watches off. They would deduct it from the company payroll. The American watchmakers applied the lessons of mass production learned during the Civil War, production of guns primarily, and started producing watches that were better or much cheaper and much better quality and more reliable than the Swiss and English watches. Up until that time, the watch factories came along. American watch production was primarily a cottage industry, just like it was in Switzerland or England. In other words, that's somebody on their kitchen table working on a watch, and it's one of a kind. If you have something break, you're gonna have to have that watchmaker make you another part to replace the part that broke. Well, there was a great demand for railroad watches at the time and clocks. And that kind of industry is not gonna survive. It can't supply the required number of clocks and watches. So the Americans learned how to do this and have interchangeable parts. Like I said, cheaper and they were better. Protectionism of the European trade guilds killed their own industry. They weren't gonna mass produce anything. They want to continue to do it at their kitchen table. Early American railroad watches that were especially made for railroad service was Appleton Tracy and Company, which is the forerunner of Waltham. It wasn't Waltham Appleton Tracy, but it was Appleton and Tracy. The model 1857, which we just call the Model 57. Elgin National Watch Company made the B.W. Raymond around 1867. Waltham made a watch. This is after they merged with Appleton Tracy. Developed a model 1870 Crescent Street. All these were 15 jewel watches. And they were adjusted to temperature. That's heat and cold. Not to position, just to
Temperature. Just the temperature.
just adjusted to temperature. Next, please. This is a photograph of a Camden and Amboy. Appleton Tracy model 1857 watch. It's key wind, key set. On the back there, you can see where you wind the mainspring. You've got to take the crystal off. It's probably in a swing out too. The crystal, swing it out to get a key on the center post, center arbor to set the hands. It was key wind and key set. Next. Throughout the 1880s, railroad watches in America were 18 size. And the thing about sizes, when we're talking 18 size, or I'll be talking about 16 size, it's a weird measurement when you start getting into sizes. Sizes are based on French lines, Lignes. And a line is a weird measurement. It's 1 5/30 of an inch. 1 5/30 of an inch is a 0 size watch. For every 5/30 of an inch that you increase in diameter, you go up a size in a watch. 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22. Up to, we've got watches up to 36. That's a Hamilton chronometer. They were primarily 18 size, 15 joule temperature adjusted. In considering the transition from English to American watches and the requirements that differ between railroad, how would you define a railroad watch? Well, I'll tell you. A railroad watch is one that met the general time service requirements that were in effect at the time it was built. That statement, that truth, was put together by Kent Singer and Ed Ubrall, who are former members of this chapter, both who are now deceased. They were Sherry's and my mentor for the 2015 National Exhibit in Chattanooga. And without them, they taught a generation of railroaders about pocket watches and times. A tremendous amount. It was a big loss. Kent Singer, they both lived at the time. Kent was no longer living in Pooler, Georgia. He moved in with his daughter up in Pennsylvania because his health was failing. And he died on November the 23rd, last year, 2024. 39 days later, on New Year's Day, Ed Ubrall died in his sleep on New Year's Day. Tremendous loss. All right, next, please. The events leading up to the definition of railroad watches, by 1853, serious accidents increased. Many accidents were blamed on timing. Cameron Amboy, 1853, had a head-on collision that killed 4. 1853, Providence and Worcester had a head-on, killed 14 people. Many researchers point to the 1891 Kipton wreck on the Lakeshore, Michigan side, up in Ohio, which killed eight people. It killed both engineers and 6 mail clerks. And I'll get to that last question here in a minute. But back in those days, those cars were made out of wooden frames. When you had a head-on collision, all that momentum, impact and momentum, caused those cars to telescope into each other. Okay. Telescopic effect. And the firemen had jumped right just before the collision, so they escaped. Probably without injury, but the engineers both went down with the ship and died. And the 6 mail clerks behind them with the Toledo Express. The fast mail, had come from Toledo going to Cleveland. And we got a map of that up there. I don't think we do.
I think it. I don't know.
The fast mail had left Toledo, headed for Cleveland. And by the same token, the train leaving Cleveland was headed for Toledo. And they had a meet at Kippen, Ohio, just out of Elyria. They were sitting in a station, and supposedly the engineer's watch stopped for 4 minutes to restart it. That's a myth, okay? First off, they broke a couple of rules to begin with. If the story about Webb C. Ball, his account was true, because he did the investigation for the Lakeshore, Michigan Southern. The conductor asked the engineer if they had time to make it from Elyria to Kipton to get on the siding before the fast mail came through. Well, if the engineer's watch did stop and restart, conductor's got a watch too. He's in charge of the train. He's the one that says you can leave or you don't leave. The engineer's not in charge of the train. Conductor's the boss. So they broke several rules. But notwithstanding, they got to Kipton okay. They were sitting there at the siding, they hadn't lined the switch, and here comes the fast money. Well, it wiped out all that, both trains. Next slide, please.
Okay, and these last ones I skipped over were the pictures of the mail cars and so
We
forth.
did have a map there.
Yeah, but that is the map. That, yeah. Yes, for that.
There's Elyria and there's Kipton.
Yeah.
Fast mail's coming from Toledo going to Cleveland. He's sitting there at Kipton waiting to lie on the track, but they hadn't gotten in yet.
Mhm. Okay,
And catastrophe occurred.
catastrophe.
Next slide. You already gone through both of the wreck slides.
Yeah, I just, we showed them
Okay.
again. Did you wanna do anything with them?
Balls, Web C ball, the answer to the question down at the bottom of that last page. Blank of Cleveland asked to develop standard for checking time. He was already an inspector for 6 different roads when he was asked by the Lake Shore in Michigan, so. There were other people out there that were doing their own time inspections. And some railroads had their own time service. They didn't sub it out to some contractor like Web C Ball. And by the way, Web C Ball never made the first wall.
No.
He just finished everybody else's watches. Like Illinois and Elgin and Hamilton and Howard and Elkhorn. Several different makers. Web C Ball standards for until the advent of quartz watches was 15 joules, had to be temperature adjusted, that's heat and cold. Heat, cold would be 34 degrees and heat was 100 degrees. And it had to maintain an accuracy of no more than plus or minus 30 seconds a week. That means you could lose 30 seconds or gain 30 seconds in a week, but no more. But those are basic because that's not the only requirements out there.
That was when it started.
Around middle of the 1890s,
Yeah, that we go on to that, I
Uh,
think.
a lot of watches at the time were key line, key set, still in use. A lot of the railroads worked 50 years. And they didn't want to have to replace a watch because a new watch came out. But they were both pennant set and lever set. Pennant set fell out of favor because that was a route for dirt to get in that stem down into the movement. And it looked like steam locomotive cab is anything but a hospital. An operating room. It's dirty. Jerry and I can both tell you that because we've been on the front end steam locomotives for 20 years up in Tennessee Valley Railroad. I was an engineer and she was my call farmer. You asked me what would make a woman do that. She knew she'd never see her husband unless she learned to do something on the road. Now, that's not what I did for a living. That was that was a life's dream. After I got my first train set at the age of 4 or 5 years old, I wanted to be a steam locomotive engineer. Tried to get on the railroad out of high school, but I had corrected vision. And you had to be Superman at the time. They'll take you off the sidewalk if you got Coke bottle glasses on today. And one good arm. But I decided that if I couldn't get a road job like I wanted, I went to school and got a degree in engineering, mechanical engineering. I built thermonuclear weapons for 30 years in Oak Ridge. That was my job. The hobby was the steam locomotive. And I lived that dream for 20 years. Well, the adjustments on a watch. And answer your question more fully when that lever set. The stem set would allow you, when you're reaching in your bib or the overall pocket, or a conductor reaching in his coat pocket, to pull that watch out by the stem, I could disengage it and reset the time. Unbeknownst to me, okay? Now I wouldn't have correct time. Well, that was one reason, but it was also a path for dirt. The other reason is, well, I just mentioned. So what they did was they put a lever on to adjust the time. You had to take the dial off or the crystal off, the bezel, and there's a little lever up the top right-hand side of the clock, the watch, around 12, either 11 o'clock or 1 o'clock, depending on who made the watch. And you lift that lever up and it disengages the
Hard
the
time.
hands, or engage the hands. So you turn it by stem to set the time on, and then you reset the lever down, put your bezel back on. It goes in your pocket. It's almost hermetically sealed. Not quite, it wasn't waterproof. But it was certainly a lot more dust-proof than originally. The adjustments on a watch. Temperature, I've already talked about, heat and cold. Isochronism means that the power is uniform as the mainspring unwinds, whether it's fully wound or it's almost wound down. It imparts the same amount of power to that escape wheel through the train gear. Next. These are the positional adjustments. I just named 3. There are 9 total adjustments. You're adjusted to all 9 of them. These are the positional adjustments. On the top right up there, you've got dialed up. Down below that, you've got dialed down. That's why you might find it on my dresser or your dresser if you came home after a day's work and put it on the dresser before you went to bed. And then the lower right is stem up. That would be the first 3 positions. So if you had a watch that was adjusted for 3 positions, those will be the 3 positions that will be adjusted. And it would keep accurate time in all those positions. When you had a watch that was adjusted to 5 positions, you would have the next 2, which is stem right and stem left. If you were adjusted to a 6th position, it would be stem down, because that's any way that watch can be found in your pocket or in my bib or my overall. So there are your 6 positional adjustments as well as the other 3 adjustments, which is a total of 9. In 1891, John Duber, owner of Duber Hampton, introduced a 17 jewel watch. This resulted in a jewel. Waltham had to re-jewel some of their 15 jewel watches, up-jewel, just to unload the inventory. So they were sending them back to the factory to up-jewel them just to catch up with John Duber.
And the jewels are like positions too. They're always gonna be in certain positions. If you have just 5 jewels, they'll be here too. Yeah.
And the 2 additional jewels, where were they placed? And
The 2 additional jewels on which form?
15.
from 15 to
How'd you get 15 to
The
7?
17 cap jewels on the balance wheel order. Before that, they were whole jewels. Now they got a cap jewel on top and bottom. It's been N shape, as they call it, in watch lingo, it's called N shape. You can't move but about 1/1000th of an inch up or down, okay? In a line. So that's where the cap jewels went, and the odd number of jewels over here on the diagram over here on the far right, on the easel on the table, shows a picture there. On a fully jeweled watch, you're gonna have 7 jewels. 7 jewels. Those are the 2 whole jewels. The balance wheel are 2 cap jewels. So there's 4. You've got a jewel in the pallet port for the lock side and one for the drop side. One that locks the escape wheel and the other one that drops to allow it to escape and allow power off the mainspring. And then you've got a roller jewel. The roller table sits below the balance table. It's got a single jewel. There's the odd jewel. There's 7 jewels. I've got watches that have got 26 jewels. But you've got jewels where jewels don't necessarily do you any good. Like on a spring barrel, a mainspring barrel. They have jewels on a mainspring barrel. I thought, boy. Then they capped
That
them.
moves section.
Not just a whole jewel, but now they go capping. Well, that was more jewel candy, but I gave you bragging rights. Okay, I got a status symbol. I've got more jewels than you've got. 1893, the general standards We had to have, here we go back to 16 size and 18 size. You gotta have open face, size 16 or 18. Plain white dial, bold black hands, bold Arabic numerals. I noticed it omits Roman numerals, which a lot of the watches were still using. Winding stem at 12 o'clock, in other words, you couldn't have a unencased watch that was cased in an open face case, because it would wind at 3. You had to have a minimum of 17 jewels. That's 1893 now, just 2 years after John Duggar came out with his 17 jewel. Had to have a double roller. Remember on that roller table I was telling you about, that was a single roller. This double roller, it prevented it from overbanking, the pallet fork from overbanking, is what it did. In case the watch was dropped, for one. And if it was dropped, you were likely going to shock load it, and it was going to break your balance staff. That was going to be a bad day for you, because it's expensive to repair. It had to be adjusted to at least 5 position. If I don't miss the stem down position. Temperature compensated between 34 and 100 degrees. And keep time again within plus or minus 30 seconds a week. Now, these were issued as guidelines, not as requirements. But you can still do what you please. These will. Next, please. This is a photograph of a Illinois Bun Special. Now, that's not a hunting case. That's an open face watch in a swing out case. You can see on the picture on the right. Movement swings out of the case and the bezel swings down to cover it up when it's back down in its case. A hunting case watch is one that's got a cover that covers the whole crystal. Next, please.
And you can see the lever here for the
Say again.
lever set watch. I was saying they can see the lever for the lever set watch. I forgot to give you
That's
your
correct,
pointer,
yeah.
but right here.
Thanks for pointing at us here.
Yeah.
See the lever right there on the right around 1 o'clock? It's past 1 o'clock. Now, on some Waltham watches, it was a lot of times it was over at around 11. In some cases, you'll find a slot with that lever on either side of the 1 or the 11. Mostly on Waltham watches.
Of course, to get to that, you take the crystal off. You unscrew the crystal
That's
front
true.
to get to it.
Early 20th century developments were you had higher jewel watches, greater than or equal to 21. Remember I said we had a jewel war. 15, for 35 years, a 15 jewel watch ruled. Now all of a sudden I've got 17 jewels. Now I've got 19. Now 21. Well, hell, let's just go ahead and do 23. Those were the Cadillac watches, primarily. Anything above 23 jewels, you're gonna pay through the nose for it. I've got a watch over here in my box right here that I can tell you, I paid through the nose for it, but it's one of a kind. I brought that from Mr. Lee Passarella, so take a look at it. I'll show it to anybody else who wants to see it. The 4-star watch in the old book. Y'all still remember the price guide by Tom Engel and Goodsey Sugar and those guys. Went out of print in 2018 because most of them were dead off.
But as Canton Head would say, a 15 joule temperature adjusted watch was perfectly capable of keeping the plus or minus 30 seconds a week.
35.
You don't need all that other, but it was.
This is 35.
Just-
Next.
I think oh, okay, no, you did that.
This is a photograph of the Illinois Bun Special. See up there at the top, the serial number up there, top left. Just below that, you'll see 21 ruby jewels. And you see those red circles down there in the gold jewel settings. Those are ruby jewels. They're not real rubies, as in gemstone rubies, they're synthetic rubies produced in a laboratory.
But originally they were either sapphires or rubies real, right?
Correct.
The
In the
early
watches.
ones, in early ones.
Over on the left, you'll see it's adjusted, and it says below that, the temperature and 6 positions and isochronism. All 9 positions. That's a full plate watch. That must be an 18 size watch. Next, we had a magnetism scare on 2 different occasions back in the 1880s. Right after the invention of the telegraph, those sounders that clicked off with the telegraph operator here, so we could determine what letter or number was being transmitted by the telegraph, was a magnet. It's a relay, essentially. And they would take the back of tins like Walter Raleigh or Prince Albert tobacco can. My grandpa used to smoke a pipe, and he used Prince Albert. They would take one of those tobacco cans and stick it behind the sound, make it amplify that click. You can see old pictures when you see a tobacco can back there, so what's that doing there? Well, that was the reason. It amplified. So there was a scare over that. And then they had electric motors. The cities, like New York and some of the larger towns up in the Northeast would not permit steam locomotives inside the city limits because of the smoke. And I can understand why, because steam engines are kind of smoky and there are a hell of a lot of smoke from steam engines. When they came along with electric motors, all the technology we had, they developed electric motors, and those were the locomotives. It propelled the trains inside the city. Or if it wasn't that, it was an overhead pantograph. Okay. Overhead wire where they had a pantograph come out and contact the wire to run a large motor below, but those were high voltage, like 12,000 volts. And your motor would, have a winding in there and it was magnetic. They were afraid that would magnetize the hairspring and cause the watch to go haywire. Run erratically, not keep good time. And then the second time, but they found out basically that was off and on. And the second time was when the diesel locomotives came on in vogue in the early or late 20s, into the 30s, until they started being adopted in the 40s, and the steam engine went bye-bye. But none of that had the effect. And by that time, materials have been developed, kind of the effects of that, and applied to hairsprings. For instance, Hamilton made Allen bar. Allen bar is an acronym for elasticity invariable. Okay? In other words, no matter what was hot or cold, it was not going to expand or contract and affect your time. And it was not magnetic. Walton came up with Con Air as their answer to that nightmare, and Elgin came up with Elgin. Each one of them a trade gun. Post-World War II, watch companies began remaining post-World War II were Walton, the great 1623 Vanguard, Hamilton 992B. Now, prior to the invention of Allen bar by Hamilton, they had put that in their watches starting in the 30s with both Hamilton watches. And by that time, they had bought out Illinois in 1928. But they're still producing Hamilton and Illinois. So some Illinois watches had the Allen bar hairspring. The Hamiltons that had them in there were marked like a 992 instead of plain, it was 992E. It was marked Allen bar under the balance plate on the plate, on the pillar plate. And those were the ones, not every watch had that in there until 1940 when the 992B came in. And from that day forward, all the B series and the Hamilton 950B, for instance, had a 92 or 950 to 992B and a 950B. 950 was a 23 jewel, 992 was a 21 jewel. Hamilton 992 had the second largest production quantity of any US built standard railroad pocket watch, exceeded only by the Hamilton 992. Now, I can't give you the figures on how many watts, but it was quite a few watches. Last American railroad watch made and sold in 1969, 992B. Now, I just mentioned that there were a lot of those watches made. Elgin Watch Company made more watches than all the other manufacturers combined. That's how many watches Elgin National. The watch inspection industry necessitated with the watch inspection, necessitated inspection criteria. Employees controlling train movements had watches inspected as often as every 2 weeks in the early days. Had watches cleaned as often as 12 to 18 months. And submitted reports and carried an inspection card. I'm gonna pass these around. And I do want them all that. This is out of my collection. What is a loaner card? These are real cards from the 20s up to the 60s. I don't have anything below, I think, the 20s and 30s. One is a loaner card. That may be the loaner right there. Now that on right there. Oh, yeah, say that at the top. But they had to have an inspection card. So they had like a license that they have on their person. A railroad official climbed up in the cab of my locomotive and wanted to see my watch inspection card. I better produce it. Because that card testified to the fact that my watch has been inspected and it will run as expected and provide reliable time. And it's in a good enough repair to do that and not vary more than plus or minus 30 seconds over. So
If he shut you down if you didn't have that car?
you got time off. Indeed, you got time off. You better have that card on. It's like a license if you're driving a car. What are they gonna do to you if you get full of your license? It's up to the cop, huh?
Fine. My grandfather was a conductor in Canadian National. I remember his watch actually scratched in the back, in the back, inside of the back case. All these dates and all, that watch was respected or.
That's correct. That was the watchmaker that actually scratched that in with a sharp instrument, very lightly.
Yeah.
You gotta have magnification to see some of these marks. That's how faint they were. Nonetheless, they're still there. And some of these watches probably inspected quite a few times. I worked with a guy up here at Tennessee Valley who worked with L&M for 47 years. You couldn't run them all. You're up there in the cab by yourself, you're your own boss. And who would want a job like that, you know? It's a cushy job, and you're getting paid quite a bit to do that. Firemen were paid somewhat less. Conductors, I'd say, were paid on par with engineers. I've got pay scale book right here. This is pay scale right here for Boston, the Main Railroad, November the 1st, 1913. I got one here for Lehigh Valley, 1922. It tells you what those guys were getting paid. Anyway. Railroads often pay for the inspection and cleaning, and jewelers supplied loaner watches. Now, a card that I just showed Chris, if you look up the top there, it'll say loaner watch. Well, that was given to that watch, that railroader, by the watchmaker that had his watch in for repair or cleaning. he had to have a card testifying that he had a watch that met the time service requirements required by the railroad to be able to use that watch, that time, even if it was a longer. So it had to be on par with his own watch, or, you know, the same quality. Railroads often employ their own inspector, for instance, the Santa Fe.
Montgomery.
Samuel Montgomery. You heard Montgomery dial? Got the circular minutes, 1 through 60 around the outside chapter. He's the one that invented that dial. That became the standard dial for Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad. It was on their, not only the Watsons that the railroads carried that were made for the Santa Fe, but other brands as well. And on their clocks, their standard clocks. They had 63 standard clocks. These were Seth Thomas 19 regulators, mercury compensating pendulum. And 63 of them. When they needed more, they went cheap. They went to Seth Thomas 70. So, but I mean, they had more than just 63 standard clocks. A lot of those clocks are still out there, but they're in somebody's collection. I know I'll be $20,000 on one and lost. Okay. Went for 28,000. I wasn't going that far. I could have, but I wasn't going.
That was last week, man.
Yeah. Actually, about 4 years ago. Clock accuracy also had to be maintained. Often only an inspector or a designee could adjust a clock's standard time. Not just tell Tom, Dick, and Harry to go up there and spike a watch or a clock. Often a designee could only post a sign, and I walked off and left my sign at home with the Santa Fe. It's a metal sign that says, "This watch is," and there's a slot down here. There's one of 21 different placards that go in its slot. This watch is
Wow.
either 1 minute fast up to 9 minutes fast, 1 minute slow to 9 minutes slow, or it is correct. And when I receive that time signal at noon, I'm looking up there at the seconds. And I would have to spike the clock to where it was. I was allowed to do that, as long as I was within that 9 seconds. It couldn't be more. If it was 10, that clock had to go back to serve. So, and the same thing went for watch inspector. Now, not every inspector changed the seconds bit, the seconds hand on the watch that he was examining. But Ted Hewitt in, I think it was North Carolina, intimated to Kent Singer and Ed Uberall that he can remember setting the hand on the second hand with his pointing and squeezing on the railroad watches that he inspected. He was 13 years old at the time when he was young, he inspected. He'd already learned the trade. He was working under his own. Classic photograph. I love this photograph. Railroad minute at the watch inspector's office. Up here on the door, it says Charles Byrne, watch inspector for the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad. That's the top railroad up here on the door. Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, and Chicago and Albany. This obviously was in his office or one of his stores in Chicago. Well, how did I know it? And I did research on Charles Byrne. Charles Byrne immigrated from Sweden. He learned the watch trade under his father, but he wanted to do more than that, than what was offered to him in Sweden. So he, ripe old age of 24, he migrated with all his wealth and his tools, and he opened Charles Byrne Jewelers in Chicago. He was so popular that he eventually had 2 more stores open. He had a chain. He was in business from 1896. Now, I don't think Charles was. He probably didn't live past the 40s. But that company was in business until the 1980s. Next slide. we'll go through this, you know, you can look
That's
up
kind
there and
That's
see.
kind of boring.
I'm not gonna read every one of those, you all can read those as well, I
Yeah.
can. But those are some of the evolutionary chapters in a watch. And time requirements on the railroad. Early railroading time was critical and watches were expensive, prized possessions. As an example, a railroader that was in a wreck at the Galitzin Curve in Pennsylvania. Wrecked his train on account of speed. It wasn't on account of time, it was on account of speed. He took the curve too fast and it left the tracks. She jumped the track. But he thought he was going to die. And he said, I want you to give my watch to my wife. It was a prized possession. Later, the telegraph was used to transmit train orders and transmit trains locations as they passed stations. Diminished but did not eliminate the need for accurate timekeeping. Today, automatic block signals, centralized traffic control, and radio communications, and even now, computers are running their train. It almost eliminated the need for accurate timekeeping, but they still have to have a watch. But an accurate, a quartz watch is accurate enough to do that. It's on par with or better than the technology we had at the time. Think about this, look at the technology we had to make these watches. Back in the 1850s through any day, the 1980s. So that's the end of my talk. Anybody got any questions? I'll be happy to answer. If I don't know the answer, I'll make something up.
Remember the, E. Howard that we featured at several of our meetings and, that our clock club restored and George big in several of them. That was purchased by the railroad in the late 1800s, you remember? And all the railroad people from Pine and Chattanooga had to go in every morning and set their watches by that clock. And they had a keeper of the clock down at the railroad. He kept that clock running. It was, Jay, I think was good within what, a minute a day, it said, or a minute a week, whatever. Give it a good
Oh,
time.
it's even closer to that. That was an astronomical regular.
Very, very accurate. And we restored that. And George had just written an article. I want y'all to look. It's coming out next month, George, right?
Well, I don't know what month it'll be, but they accepted the draft. It's about the Christmas ornament from 2021. That the state issued a Christmas ornament based on the clock that's in the Capitol. So I did some pictures. Pete gave me a picture of the clock that he had taken at the Capitol. And I took pictures of the ornament and the insert and stuff.
Question, sir. You mentioned earlier about when in the time zones, traveling from east to west, you said every 12 miles it changes a minute.
12.5 miles, yeah.
12.5 miles it changes 1 minute?
1 minute.
Okay.
Well, approximately now, approximately. That's
East,
depending on,
east, okay.
that's depending on where the sun is directly overhead. During the summer solstice. Okay? But you've already passed the longest day, that was 14 hours and 31 minutes of daylight. On June the 20th this year.
June 20th, yeah, okay.
You've almost lost an hour already since June.
Well, of course, we're gonna be able to get off the track for whatever reason. How did they communicate between the two trains?
You did.
They did until they had radios.
You had a timetable, you better be operating off that timetable.
Yep.
You better be on
Yeah,
the siding, if you had a siding, you better be on the siding when the opposing train was gonna meet you.
Yep.
And trains were managed by right, class, or direction.
Yeah.
You were a superior train or an inferior train, depending on which direction you were going. If I'm superior to you, I'm gonna expect you to be on the damn side. Okay? If you're not, it's gonna be a bad day for both of us. We're gonna have a cornfield.
Jump off.
Yeah. Any more questions?
Did they know the 15 jewel watches were better than, were just as good as the 26 jewel watches back in the day?
Well, we maintain plus or minus 30 seconds a week.
So then was there like a sort of a side market among people that knew that?
Well, here's the
watch.
Here's the deal, to put that in perspective, for you. For 35 years, 15 jewel watch rule.
Okay.
The market was saturated with 15 jewel watches. Jewelers weren't moving watches.
Yeah, that makes sense.
What do I need? I need to make something better. I'm gonna put 2 more jewels.
Like
4 more jewels,
I have an iPhone.
6 more jewels,
Yeah.
okay? Now I've got something to market. Oh, you got more jewels than I got. I gotta have more of those.
It's like, what do you want to drive? A Ford or a Lamborghini? You know?
We have a question from Pete Shrine. Pete, go ahead.
Two things. Isochronism refers to the balance wheel not changing its period as the power is changed. So it's
Right.
lead spring, it is the balance wheel hairspring combination. Okay, that's isochronism. Yes,
Gotcha.
the amplitude decreases as the power decreases, but the period is not supposed to change.
Thank you. Thank you, Pete.
That's good. That's a good explanation.